My daughter sold my beach house to her husband's parents and told me, with a straight face, "You don't need it anymore." The words didn't come out in a heated argument or a tearful confrontation. They were delivered over the phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the faded blueprints of that house that I'd spread out to review a small renovation I'd been planning for the summer. I remember gripping the phone a little tighter, my knuckles whitening as I tried to process the fact that the place I had spent 3 decades pouring my time, money, and sweat into was suddenly gone, not to a stranger who had made an irresistible offer, but to people who had circled around it like vultures for years. People I had never trusted, people who now had the audacity to act as if this was some sort of gift from the family. At first, I thought I had misheard her, that maybe she was talking about renting it out or some kind of temporary arrangement while I was away. But when I asked her to repeat herself, she didn't hesitate. "It's theirs now, Dad," she said, her tone infuriatingly calm, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced saying in the mirror until it came out without a trace of guilt. I could hear faint voices in the background, muffled but unmistakable. Her husband's parents, talking to someone, maybe celebrating. I didn't shout. I didn't ask her if she'd lost her mind. Instead, I sat there listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me, the ticking of the wall clock that suddenly felt too loud, and I realized that the quiet in my house was the same kind of quiet I used to hear at the beach house late at night, where the wave would settle and the wind would die down, a quiet before something big changed, before a storm rolled in. I knew right then that whatever was happening was an accident, and it hadn't happened overnight. This had been in motion for a long time, probably long before she had the courage or the nerve to tell me. I asked her one question: "How exactly did you sell a property that's in my name?" She sighed in a way that made it sound like I was the one being unreasonable, and then she launched into a clipped explanation about streamlining ownership and joint decision-making and not letting things go to waste. Phrases that didn't sound like her at all but sounded exactly like something her husband's father would say, the same man who had once cornered me at a barbecue and told me I should consider transferring the property to the younger generation before I got too old to maintain it. Back then, I had laughed it off and changed the subject. Now, sitting there with the phone warm against my ear, I realized that he must have been laying the groundwork even then. My daughter's voice stayed maddeningly steady as she told me that, because of a power of attorney document I had signed 2 years ago when I was recovering from surgery, something she had insisted on just in case I needed help handling bills. She had been able to sign over property without my direct involvement. She framed it as if she'd done me a favor, removing the burden of upkeep, selling it to people we know, so I wouldn't have to deal with strangers. It was in that moment that I understood this wasn't just about a house, and it wasn't even just about money. It was about control. They had found a way to make a decision for me, to take something from me under the guise of helping, and they expected me to accept it quietly because, after all, you don't need it anymore. I let her talk, every word sharpening my focus instead of breaking it. She mentioned the sale price, far less than the property's real value, and the fact that they'd already transferred the deed. I knew she was trying to present it as a done deal, but I also knew the coast, the local council, and the property laws better than anyone in her husband's family. That beach house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was a structure tied to land with old covenants, shared dock access, and certain rights that couldn't be separated from my name without specific filings that I was fairly certain had not been made. When she finished, there was a long silence on my end, the kind of silence people mistake for shock or defeat. In reality, I was already tracing the outlines of my next moves in my mind, starting with the paperwork I needed to dig out of my filing cabinet. I told her, all right, in a tone as flat as a tide on a windless morning, and before she could say anything else, I ended the call. I sat there for a moment, staring at the blueprints on the table, remembering the day I first laid them out with the architect 30 years ago. I remembered choosing the wide porch that wrapped around the west side, so we could watch the sunsets without leaving our chairs, the cedar paneling because it held up best against the salt air, and the kitchen window that faced the ocean so whoever was cooking could still feel connected to the water. That house had been built for family, and now a part of that family had decided it was no longer mine. The betrayal burned, but it also clarified things. I thought about the years of property tax payments, the repairs after each storm, the weekend spent sanding and painting the deck boards instead of doing something easier. I thought about how I'd kept the house in my name even when my daughter got married, even when I'd let them use it for their honeymoon, because it was supposed to be something I could pass down when I chose to, not something taken from me, because they decided I didn't need it. By the time I stood up from the table, I knew I wasn't going to try to talk her out of it or plead for understanding. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't what the situation called for. I was going to let her believe, for now, that she had pulled something irreversible. And when the time came, I was going to make sure she and her husband's parents learned exactly how wrong they were. The beach house hadn't always been some pristine symbol of wealth or a trophy property for family gatherings. When I first laid eyes on it, it was a sagging, salt-beaten structure with warped siding, cracked windows, and a leaky roof that whistled when the wind came in from the east, and I bought it not because it was perfect, but because I saw what could become if I was willing to put in the kind of work most people avoid. I had been in my mid-30s, working long shifts at the shipyard, saving every spare dollar, and when the listing popped up in the local paper, I drove out to see it the same day. The smell of the place was the first thing I remember, that mix of old wood, brine, and something faintly metallic that comes from years of coastal dampness, the kind of smell that tells you it's been sitting too long without love. The previous owner, an old fisherman named Leonard, was living in town with his daughter by then, and he'd told me straight out that the place wasn't much to look at, but she's got bones. He wasn't wrong. Under the peeling paint and the rotted porch boards, there was a solid frame, thick cedar beams, and a foundation that had withstood storms worse than anything I'd seen in my lifetime. I bought it for a price that made friends raise their eyebrows. Not because it was cheap, but because they couldn't understand why I'd sink that much money into something so run down. And then I spent the next 4 years turning it into something worth keeping. Every spare weekend, every evening when the daylight lasted long enough after work, I was there with a hammer, a paintbrush, or a pry bar in my hands. I tore out the moldy insulation, replaced every window with double-pane glass to keep the winter wind out, and built the porch I'd always wanted. Wide enough for 6 people to sit comfortably and high enough that you could see the horizon line over the dunes without craning your neck. When my daughter was little, she spent her summers there with me, running barefoot across the sand, collecting shells until her pockets bulged, sleeping in the upstairs bedroom with the window cracked, so she could hear the waves as she drifted off. Those summers are what I thought of whenever I had to make a repair. Patching a leak in the roof after a nor'easter, repainting the shutters when the salt air ate away at the color, replacing a section of the dock after a winter of ice damage. Every dollar and every hour I put into that place wasn't just maintenance. It was an investment in something I assumed would outlast me and stay in the family on my terms. Her husband came into the picture much later, long after the house was finished and long after my daughter had stopped asking to come down on weekends. At first, he seemed harmless enough polite, helpful when it came to carrying things, always quick to thank me for dinner. But there was something in the way he looked at the beach house that I noticed early on, the way some men look at a boat or a classic car they don't own yet but have already decided they'd like to. He'd ask little questions about the property, how much the taxes were, what kind of upkeep it needed, whether I'd ever considered cashing out since coastal property values were on the rise. I'd give short, factual answers and move the conversation along, but I filed those questions away in the back of my mind. His parents, on the other hand, didn't bother to hide their interest. They were the kind of people who spoke in compliments that had barbs under them. What a beautiful place. I can't believe you still keep up all by yourself. Or, it must be so much work at your age. Have you thought about letting someone else take over? I always answered politely, because that's what my daughter expected, but I knew exactly what they were hinting at, and I made it clear, at least in my own way, that the beach house wasn't going anywhere. When my health took a hit a couple of years ago, a surgery that had me laid up for weeks, my daughter had offered to help with the bills and insisted on having me sign a power of attorney, just so she could keep things running if I wasn't able to. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. She was my only child, and I trusted her. That trust was something I never thought I'd have reason to question, because I'd spent my life giving her what she needed, making sure she had a home, an education, and a start in life that was better than what I'd had. It wasn't just the property I'd invested in. It was her future. I had dipped into my retirement fund to pay for her college tuition when the scholarships didn't cover everything. I had helped with the down payment on her first house when she and her husband were just starting out. When they wanted a bigger place for the family they said they planned to have, I co-signed a loan so they could get it. Every time, I told myself it was worth it, because family looks out for each other, and I never thought for a second that any of it would come back to bite me. That's what made the call about the beach house hit differently. This wasn't just a bad decision or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate choice to take something that wasn't hers to give, to side with her husband's family over her own father, and to do it in a way that left me out of the conversation entirely. And it wasn't as though she didn't understand what the place meant to me. She'd lived those summers. She'd seen the work that went into every shingle, every plank, every bit of the dock. The night after the call, I drove down to the coast. I didn't call ahead, didn't tell anyone I was coming. I just unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood there listening to the creak of the floorboards and the distant crash of the waves through the open windows. The furniture was still mine, the photograph still on the mantel, but there was a strange stillness to it, as if the house already knew it was no longer entirely mine. I walked through each room, taking in the details. The mark on the kitchen wall where my daughter had measured her height every summer until she was 15. The worn armrest on the living room chair where I used to sit with a book in the evenings. The faint scent of cedar from the paneling upstairs. This was the place I'd always thought she would bring her own children to. The place that would tie the generations together. And now it was just another asset that had been shuffled around to suit someone else's idea of need. By the time I locked up and walked back to my truck, I knew I wasn't going to let it stand. Maybe I couldn't reverse the paperwork outright, but there were other ways to make sure they understood that nothing tied to that house would come easy. I had built it from the ground up, and I knew every nail, every inch of plumbing, every clause in the property agreements that governed it. They might have thought they'd taken ownership, but they hadn't taken control, and that was a difference I planned to make very clear. The drive home from the coast that night felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or weather, but because my mind was running through every detail of what had just unfolded. Every word from that phone call replaying in my head. Every image of the house as I had seen it hours before, still holding the marks and memories of my life, yet now, according to my own daughter, belonging to someone else. I kept one hand steady on the wheel and the other resting on the worn leather of the armrest, the faint creak of the truck's suspension as familiar as the sound of the tide, and I thought about how betrayal doesn't always come like a sudden strike. Sometimes it's the slow accumulation of moments you didn't question at the time, the conversations you brushed off, the paperwork you signed because you trusted the person handing it to you. There was no denying the weight of what she had done. This wasn't just a legal maneuver or a misunderstanding over property boundaries. This was my only child deciding, without my consent, that something I had spent decades building, maintaining, and protecting was better off in the hands of people who had contributed nothing to it. I could remember the day I signed that power of attorney document after my surgery, my daughter sitting beside my hospital bed, telling me it was just so she could handle the bills while I recovered, her voice warm, reassuring, and full of the kind of confidence I had always wanted her to have. I hadn't seen the trap in it, hadn't considered that it could be used for anything beyond paying the property tax or renewing the insurance. What stung the most wasn't just the act itself, but the casual way she had said, "You don't need it anymore," as if my age or my lifestyle or the fact that I lived in town now made me less entitled to something I had earned with my own hands. I thought about all the summers the first had chosen to work overtime at the shipyard, so I could afford repairs after a storm rather than taking a vacation. I thought about the winter I drove down to the coast every weekend with a generator in the back of the truck, because the power lines had been knocked down and I didn't want the pipes to freeze. I thought about the years when I was still paying off the mortgage and every other bill felt like a tightrope walk, yet I never considered selling the place, because it was worth more than money. It was part of the family's backbone. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, I poured myself a coffee even though it was nearly midnight, because I knew sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. The room was dim except for the yellow pool of light from the overhead fixture, and the shadows it cast seemed to lean in on me as I opened the drawer where I kept the property files. I spread them out just like I had the day I bought the house. Deeds, tax receipts, copies of insurance claims, every scrap of paper I'd ever thought might be important. My eyes landed on the original deed, my name still printed clearly as the owner record, and I realized that whatever had been signed over would have to show up in the county registry. If it wasn't there yet, I still had time to make things difficult for them. I thought about calling her right then, demanding answers, but I knew it would be a waste. She would stick to the same lines she had rehearsed, the same hollow justifications about lightening my load and keeping in the family, though she clearly meant her husband's family, not mine. No, what I needed was another argument. What I needed was clarity, a full picture of what had been done and how. The emotional punch of it all kept hitting in waves. One moment I would be furious, imagining my daughter standing beside her in-laws as they walked through my house like they owned it, opening the cupboards, running their fingers along the windowsills, looking at the view from the porch that I had spent months designing. The next moment I would feel a hollow ache in my chest, wondering how she had reached the point where she could do this and still think she could call me dad without it sounding false. I had raised her to be independent, yes, but also, to be fair, to respect the effort it takes to build something worth keeping. Somewhere along the way, either I had failed to teach her that, or she had decided it didn't apply when there was something to be gained. I remembered her as a little girl sitting cross-legged on the porch, a bowl of watermelon slices beside her, juice running down her chin as she looked out at the ocean. I remembered the day she caught her first fish off the dock, her shriek of excitement echoing over the water as I helped her reel it in. These weren't just sentimental snapshots. They were proof that she had once understood the value of that place. Not in dollars, but in the way it anchored us as a family. That's what made the betrayal so sharp. She knew exactly what she was taking from me. At one point, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to think about until then. Was this really about the house, or was it about seeing if she could take from me without consequence? People test boundaries in different ways, and maybe this was hers. To see if the man who had always given, who had always said yes when asked for help, would finally say no when something that mattered to him was on the line. That thought shifted something in me. The pain of the betrayal was still there, but now it was wrapped in a thread of steel. I realized that this wasn't just about reclaiming a piece of property. It was about showing her, and the people she had aligned herself with, that I wasn't someone they could outmaneuver with fine print and family guilt. I had let a lot of things slide over the years in the name of keeping peace, but this wasn't going to be one of them. I gathered the papers back into the folder, my hand steady now, and slid them into my briefcase. There was a certain calm that came with knowing I had a direction, even if the steps weren't entirely clear yet. I would start with the county office in the morning, pull the most recent filings, and see exactly what had been transferred and when. From there, I could map out my next moves, and every one of them would be deliberate, quiet, and impossible for them to undo without costing themselves far more than they had gained. As I rinsed out the coffee cup and turned off the light, I thought again about her words. You don't need it anymore. Maybe that was her way of saying she thought my time had passed, that I was supposed to step aside and let someone else decide what was worth keeping. But the truth was, I had never needed the beach house in the way they thought I did. I had chosen it, built it, and kept it not because I had to, but because I wanted to, and that was exactly why I wasn't going to let anyone else decide when my connection to it ended. By the next morning, the haze of disbelief had burned off like morning fog over the coast, replaced with sharp, clear sense of purpose that made every movement feel deliberate, from the way I buttoned my shirt to the way I locked the front door before heading out. I had decided before my first cup of coffee that there would be no phone calls to plead or to bargain, no emotional appeals to the daughter who had already shown me that her loyalty could be shifted with the right words from her husband's family. This was no longer a matter of family discussion. This was about reclaiming control, using the tools they thought I didn't know how to use. I drove straight to the county clerk's office, the same building where, 3 decades earlier, I had signed the papers that put the beach house in my name. The clerk behind the counter was new to me, a young man with a kind of polite, but detached demeanor you see in people who process paperwork all day. And when I gave him the property address and asked for the most recent filings, he didn't blink before pulling it up on his screen. A few minutes later, he slid a printed packet across the counter. The thin paper still warm from the copier, and I saw in black and white the record of the transfer, my name replaced, the new deed listing my daughter as a grantor and her husband's parents as the grantees. The document referenced the power of attorney I'd signed during my recovery, which had been notarized and filed right there in that same building. I remember the day it was signed vividly. Me in a hospital bed, still under the haze of pain medication, and my daughter saying, "It's just a formality, Dad." Now that same signature, mine, was being used as a lever to pry away something I'd never have agreed to give. I scanned the rest of the packet and noticed something that made my jaw tighten. The sale price was far below the market value, almost laughably so, and it was marked as an intra-family transaction, which meant they'd likely skirt around certain tax obligations. That wasn't just unethical, it was sloppy. Sloppy could be exploited. I asked the clerk for certified copies of everything, and as he stamped and signed them, I thought about how they must have assumed I'd be too old, too tired, or too unfamiliar with the legal system to bother digging into the details. They had underestimated me, and that, I knew, would be their undoing. From the clerk's office, I drove to the local zoning department. The beach house sat on a stretch of coastline governed by a mess of old regulations. Easement rights to the dock, shared access paths to the dunes, and environmental restrictions that required permits for even the smallest changes. I had spent years navigating those rules, getting to know the inspectors, and making sure every improvement I made was logged and compliant. That paper trail meant I knew exactly which strings could be pulled to make life difficult for anyone who thought they could just take over without respecting the process. I learned quickly that the dock permit was still in my name, as were the rights to the small strip of land that provided the only legal access from the main road to property. Those rights weren't automatically transferred with the house. They were tied to me personally, and changing that required a separate filing one I hadn't signed. That meant the new owners could find themselves with a beautiful house they couldn't legally reach without crossing land still under my control. I didn't smile as the zoning clerk confirmed it, but I felt the first spark of satisfaction I'd had in days. On the drive home, I mentally listed every connection I still had in that part of the county. Old neighbors, the marina manager, the head of the local fishermen's association, and I knew that word of the situation would spread quickly once I decided to start asking questions. In small coastal communities, property changes hands less often than people think, and when it does, everyone notices. If my daughter's in-laws thought they could quietly slide into ownership without a ripple, they were about to discover how small a pond they'd stepped into. By the time I got home, I had shifted from simple anger into a cold, methodical mindset. I pulled out a legal pad and started mapping everything I had learned: the undervalued sale price, the interfamily transaction note, the dock and access rights, the tax implications they might not have considered. I wrote it all in neat, tight lines because I wanted to see the whole picture laid out in front of me, every potential weakness, every opportunity to remind them that possession was not the same thing as ownership. The more I wrote, the more I realized how much leverage I actually had. The access rights alone were enough to cause them headaches, but combined with the dock permit, the environmental restrictions, and the possibility of a tax audit, if someone were to quietly tip off the right office about the suspiciously low sale price, it became clear that I didn't need to win the house back outright to make my point. What I needed was to make their ownership so inconvenient, so costly, and so mired in red tape that they'd either beg me to take it back or sell it to someone else out of sheer frustration. I thought about calling a lawyer right then, but I decided against it, at least for the moment. Lawyers have their place, but they also move at their own pace, and I didn't want anyone else steering this ship yet. This was still my fight, and I wanted to control the timing, the sequence, and the delivery of each blow. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd gotten the news, the folder of property documents open beside me, and I made a second list, not of legal facts, but of personal lines that had been crossed. Times I had helped my daughter when she could have stood on her own. Times I had bent over backward to accommodate her husband's family when I didn't need to. Times I had looked the other way when they made comments about the beach house that should have set off alarms. Seeing those moments in writing made it impossible to pretend this was just a one-off betrayal. This was a culmination of years of small encroachments, each one dismissed as harmless until they finally took the biggest piece they could get their hands on. By the time I put down my pen, I wasn't just ready to fight. I was committed to making this a fight they would regret starting. Every move from here on out would be deliberate, targeted, and carried out without a single wasted word. They had taken the first shot, but I was going to make sure I had the last one. The morning after I finished my list, I woke with a kind of focus that doesn't need coffee to sharpen, a clarity that told me the first step wasn't to make a dramatic move, but to start pulling threads, one at a time, until the whole thing began to unravel in their hands. I knew from experience that real leverage doesn't come from noise. It comes from precision, from striking in places the other side doesn't even realize are weak until the damage is already done. I started with a dock permit, because I knew that without it, the property lost a significant part of its appeal. The permit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the legal right to moor a boat, to maintain that dock against the shifting sands and tides, and without it, the dock itself could be ordered removed by the county. I drove down to the coastal permits office, a low, weathered building that smelled faintly of coffee and salt air, and asked to speak directly with Marlene, the clerk who'd been handling my renewals for over a decade. She greeted me with a smile that told me she still remembered the time I'd brought her a bag of fresh blue crabs after a good haul. When I explained the situation in measured, factual terms, leaving out names but making it clear that the property had been transferred without my consent, she didn't waste time lecturing me on family disputes. Instead, she pulled up the file and confirmed what I already suspected. The permit was still in my name, and transfer would require my signature along with a separate inspection of the dock's condition. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. You know, Samuel, if that inspection happens and there are issues, the county can order a temporary suspension until repairs are made. And if those repairs aren't made by the permit holder, she didn't have to finish the sentence. Without me, that dock was just a pile of wood sticking out into the water, one good storm away from being debris. I thanked her, requested an inspection for the following week, knowing full well there were a few minor issues I'd forgotten to repair, and walked out feeling the first small satisfaction of having set something in motion. They wouldn't know it yet, but the countdown had begun. Next, I turned to the access easement, the narrow strip of land between the main road and the property, which I had bought separately years after acquiring the house. It wasn't much to look at, just a gravel drive lined with beach grass and scrub pine, but was the only legal way to reach the house without crossing private property. I had kept it in my name deliberately, partly because it gave me control over maintenance, but now that decision was about to become the linchpin in my plan. I called the surveyor who had helped me with the original easement agreement. He still had my files, and after a short conversation, he agreed to update the official records to make it crystal clear that the right-of-way was tied to a renewable license, not a permanent grant. That meant the new owners could continue using it only as long as I allowed, and license renewals, of course, came with conditions. I didn't have to block access immediately. All I had to do was remind them, at the right moment, that the ground they drove over to get to their prized house was mine. With those two pieces in motion, I shifted to the financial side. The undervalued sale price and intra-family label were practically begging for scrutiny, and while I wasn't going to march into the tax office myself, I knew exactly how to make sure the right eyes landed on it. I drafted a short, anonymous letter to the State Revenue Department, flagging a potential misclassification of a property sale in the county and including the parcel number. I didn't accuse anyone of fraud. I simply pointed out the disparity between the recorded sale price and the current market value, along with the fact that the buyers had no documented family relationship to the seller beyond marriage. Once that letter was mailed, it would sit quietly in a pile until it was processed, and then, without me lifting another finger, it would trigger a review that could result in fines, back taxes, and audits. Every action I took that day was quiet, methodical, and left no direct trail back to me beyond what was already public record. I wasn't hiding. I simply understood that a clean move is harder to counterattack. My daughters-in-laws would eventually feel the pressure, but by the time they realized the source, it would be too late to undo most of it. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with the day's notes spread out in front of me, I thought about the contrast between what they expected from me and what they were about to get. They'd counted on me to be passive, to mutter about my disappointment, and then fade into the background while they enjoyed their new acquisition. They didn't realize that the same stubbornness that had kept that house standing through 3 decades of storms was now focused entirely on making their ownership a burden. I also thought about my daughter, not in a sentimental way, but with a cold assessment of her role in all this. Whether she had been manipulated or had acted entirely of her own accord didn't change the fact that she had signed away something that wasn't hers to give. I decided then that I wouldn't confront her until I was ready for the final act. When every move I had made had already boxed them in so tightly that there was nowhere left for them to turn. She had chosen her side. Now she would see what that choice cost. The following morning, I made one more move, this one purely strategic. I called the Homeowners Association for that stretch of coast. They'd always left me alone because I kept the property in excellent condition, but I knew they had a thick binder of bylaws that could be wielded like a hammer in the right hands. I asked for a copy, feigning interest in keeping up with the latest revisions, and when it arrived in the mail 3 days later, I spent the evening flipping to the pages, marking every clause about maintenance deadlines, approved contractors, and prohibited alterations. In the hand of an unfriendly neighbor, and I had a few I could count on, those rules could become another source of friction for the new owners. By the end of the week, I had set 4 separate chains of consequence in motion: the dock inspection, the easement clarification, the potential tax review, and the HOA bylaw angle. None of them would explode immediately, but together they would create a constant drumbeat of problems, each one chipping away at the sense of security they thought they'd bought. And through it all, I kept my mouth shut. No warnings, no hints, no angry voicemails of my daughter to use as proof that I was overreacting. Let them think I had sulked and moved on. The quieter I stayed, the louder the pressure would feel when it started closing in. It didn't take long for them to realize that something wasn't quite right with their new prize, though it was clear they didn't connect the dots immediately. The first sign came 3 days after the dock inspection had taken place, when I received a voicemail from my daughter's husband. Not his parents, not my daughter herself, but him, his voice tight in that way people get when they're trying to sound calm while barely holding back irritation. He said there had been some issues flagged by the county and asked if I knew anything about it, framing it as though I might have accidentally let a permit lapse or forgotten to repair something. I didn't call him back. Instead, I listened to that voicemail twice, making note of how quickly they'd gone from celebrating their acquisition to running into obstacles they couldn't solve without me. They probably assumed the inspection was routine and that the flag repairs were a minor nuisance, but I knew from experience that once the county puts a suspension on a dock permit, the paperwork to lift it can drag on for months, especially if the owner doesn't know which contractors are approved and which repairs need which forms. I had dealt with it before. They hadn't. 2 days later, the next ripple reached me, this time from my daughter. She called in the early evening, her tone noticeably different from the last conversation we'd had. Gone was the clipped, matter-of-fact delivery she'd used when telling me, "You don't need it anymore." Now her voice was softer, careful, almost like the way she used to talk to me when she wanted to ask for money without saying the word. She started by saying she'd been thinking about how things had unfolded and wanted to make sure there weren't any lingering misunderstandings. I let her talk, offering nothing but short acknowledgments, and I see, go on. It didn't take long for her to get to the point. "There are just a few issues with the house we didn't anticipate," she said, and then she brought up the dock, framing it as if the county was overcomplicating things, and suggesting that maybe I could help smooth it over since you've dealt with them before. I told her calmly that I no longer had anything to do with the property, and that the new owners would have to handle their own permits. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just stated the fact, let the silence stretch, and then said I had to go. The next attempt came from her husband's mother, direct, confrontational, and without a trace of charm. She called the following afternoon, and before I could even say hello, she launched into a tirade about how petty I was being by withholding information and creating unnecessary complications over a simple property transfer. She accused me of trying to sabotage their enjoyment of what's rightfully ours, and even had the audacity to suggest that I should be grateful the house was staying in the extended family. I let her run herself out, not giving her the satisfaction of an interruption, and when she finally stopped to catch her breath, I said in an even tone, "The house isn't mine anymore. Neither are its problems. Handle them however you see fit." And then I hung up. It was almost too easy to predict what came next. When they couldn't get the cooperation they expected, they turned to guilt. My daughter sent a long text message that night, The kind that reads like it's been drafted, edited, and rewritten to hit every emotional button she could find. She talked about family unity, about not letting disagreements drive us apart, and even about how my late wife wouldn't want us fighting like this. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember exactly how she was framing herself as a peacemaker in a situation she had created. I didn't reply. The truth was, by that point, the other levers I'd set in motion were starting to do their work. The letter to the state revenue department had apparently landed where it needed to, because a neighbor I still spoke to told me they'd seen a tax assessor's vehicle parked outside the beach house. That would mean questions, document requests, and possibly a reassessment that could result in a hefty back tax bill, especially if the undervalued sale price was determined to be a deliberate misrepresentation. Then there was the easement. I had received a polite but formal request in the mail from their lawyer asking for the easement, rights to be transferred, to prevent any future misunderstandings. The fact that they'd gone to the trouble of having a lawyer send the letter told me they'd discovered the reality. Without my cooperation, their access to the property was on paper as fragile as a strip of sand in a storm. I didn't respond to that letter either, because the longer they stewed on the uncertainty, the more valuable my position became. It was around this time that the social pressure started. A mutual acquaintance from the marina, someone I'd always gotten along with, approached me while I was fueling my boat and said he'd heard through the grapevine that I was being stubborn about the beach house. He didn't accuse me of anything outright, but it was clear that the in-laws were telling anyone who'd listen that I was holding grudges over nothing. I kept my reply short. If they want to own it, they can own all of it, problems included. That was all I said before walking away, but I knew the message would make its way back to them. The thing about retaliation is that it often reveals desperation, and desperation makes people sloppy. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched as they tried every possible angle to pull me back in the fold. Guilt, public pressure, legal nudges, and none of it worked. Meanwhile, the HOA bylaw booklet I'd requested turned out to be even more useful than I expected. I made a quiet call to an old neighbor who sat on the HOA board, and within a week, a compliance letter had been sent to the new owners regarding unapproved exterior modifications. Namely, a set of cheap-looking lawn chairs they placed on the dunes, which violated protected sandgrass ordinance. It was a minor infraction, but it sent the message that every move they made would be under a microscope. By the end of that month, they were juggling the dock suspension, the looming tax review, the easement uncertainty, and the HOA's sudden interest in their activities, and still they hadn't had a single direct victory against me. They were burning time, money, and energy just to hold on to what they thought they'd taken so easily. Every call they made, every letter they sent, every sideways attempt to paint me as the unreasonable one only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't arguing, and I wasn't giving them a single piece of leverage they could twist back at me. I was simply letting the weight of their own choices press down harder and harder, knowing that sooner or later something would crack, and when it did, I would be ready to deliver the final turn of the screw. By the time the second month rolled around since they'd taken over the beach house, the pressure I had set in motion was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It had risen to the surface and was breaking over their heads in waves they couldn't swim through without choking. The dock permit remained suspended because the county inspector had returned for a follow-up and found even more deficiencies, this time citing safety concerns that would require structural repairs, not just cosmetic fixes. The tax review had progressed far enough that a second vehicle from the state revenue department had been spotted at the property, clipboard in hand, taking photos from multiple angles. The HOA had sent 2 additional letters, one regarding their use of unapproved contractors for maintenance, and another for a noisy gathering that violated quiet hour rules. And through it all, the easement issue, the one piece I knew kept them up at night, hung over them like a shadow they couldn't shake. I had kept my distance publicly, speaking to no one about the situation unless directly asked, and even then, offering only the kind of clipped, neutral responses that gave nothing away. But behind the scenes, I was lining up the final move, one that would pull every thread I'd set in motion into one sharp, clean cut they couldn't recover from. I knew from the start that the easement would be my lever for the final strike, but I didn't want to simply close it off. I wanted to make the act so visible, so undeniable, that the humiliation would stick to them long after the legal dust settled. The opportunity came when the HOA announced that their annual summer meeting would be held at the community hall, just 2 streets over from the beach house, on the first Saturday of the month. Attendance was always high for those meetings because it was part business, part social gathering, and in a small coastal community. It was where reputations were either polished or tarnished. The new owners would have no choice but to attend. They were already under scrutiny from the board, and absence would only make them look worse. That was when I decided the meeting would be the stage for their undoing. I spent the week before the meeting preparing the necessary paperwork to revoke the easement license, having the surveyor update the map, and my lawyer draft a formal notice. The beauty of it was that everything was perfectly legal, impeccably documented, and delivered with the kind of timing that would leave them reeling. I scheduled the notice to be hand-delivered by a process server at precisely 9:15 a.m. on the morning of the meeting, which started at 10 o'clock. That way, they received the news with just enough time to panic, but not enough to rally a response before walking into a room full of their neighbors. The morning arrived warm and clear, the kind of day people in that community remember for beach outings and barbecues. But for me, it was about something else entirely. I sat in my truck in the small lot behind the community hall, my window cracked just enough to hear the low murmur of early arrivals greeting each other. At 9:18, I saw the process server sedan pull up in front of the beach house, watched him step out in his crisp shirt and sunglasses, a clipboard in hand. He knocked firmly, waited, and then handed over the thick envelope to the husband's mother, who opened it right there on the porch. Even from a distance, I could see the stiffness in her shoulders as she read the first page, her lips tightening to a thin line, and I knew she'd gotten to the part that spelled out, in precise legal language, that their right to use the only access to the property would terminate in 30 days. By 9:30, I was inside the community hall, taking a seat near the back where I could see the whole room without drawing attention to myself. The meeting started promptly at 10 o'clock, with the HOA president giving her usual updates on budgets, maintenance schedules, and seasonal reminders. About 15 minutes in, the new owners arrived, sliding into seats near the middle, their expressions tight and their movements stiff. Word travels fast in a small room, and I could see a few heads turning in their direction, subtle glances passing between neighbors who had likely heard the news already. Then came the part of the meeting reserved for community concerns, where residents could bring up issues or complaints. It didn't take long before my neighbor on the board, the one I'd tipped off weeks earlier about their bylaw violations, raised her hand. She brought up the dock permit suspension and how it reflected on the neighborhood's compliance record, asking pointedly what the new owners planned to do about it. The husband's mother tried to deflect, saying it was in process, but her voice lacked conviction, and the room could smell it. That's when I stood up. I didn't speak loudly, but the room quieted as soon as they realized I was addressing the chair. I stated clearly that, as of that morning, I had revoked the easement license for property in question, that the decision was final, and that I would be filing the updated records of the county by the end of the week. I didn't elaborate. I didn't offer justifications. I simply made the statement, nodded to the chair, and sat back down. The effect was immediate. Conversations broke out in low murmurs. People shifted in their seats. And the new owners, my daughters-in-laws, sat frozen, unable to respond without either lying or admitting they had no legal right to reach their own property after the 30-day window. The rest of the meeting moved on without them saying another word. By the time it adjourned, the hall was buzzing with speculation, and I could see them making a beeline for the exit, their faces set in hard lines. My daughter avoided looking at me as she followed them out. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. The damage was done, and in that room, among those neighbors, their standing had shifted permanently. Over the next few weeks, the consequences began to stack. Without legal access, they were forced to negotiate with me if they wanted to keep the house, and my terms were not generous. I offered to repurchase it at a price slightly above what they had paid in their undervalued sale, which was still well below market value, but I made it clear that the offer would expire at the end of the 30 days. They tried to bluff, threatening to take me to court, but the legal realities were against them, and they knew it. By the final week, they folded, signing the papers to return the property to me. When it was over, I walked through the beach house alone, the salt air drifting through the open windows just as it had the first day I stepped inside all those years ago. The dock still needed repairs. The HOA still had its rules, and the house bore the small signs of their brief and careless ownership. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that it was mine again, not because I had pleaded for it, not because I had begged for their goodwill, but because I had taken it back on my terms. And as for my daughter, I didn't need to say much. She knew what she'd done, and she knew that the bridge between us now had a permanent scar. I didn't close the door on her entirely, but I made it clear that trust, once broken like this, wouldn't come back with a few well-chosen words. She had chosen her side, and she had learned, in front of everyone who mattered in that small coastal community, that her choice came with a cost.